This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlord of Kor by Terry Carr, Chapter 9. Mara's frown deepened. She looked around them in the dimness, her eyes taking in the complexity and extent of the circuitry. It faded into the darkness behind them. Lines ran into walls and floor. "They built their computers in the grand manner, didn't they?" she said softly. "I've seen fragments of them before," Rayanson said. "This is a big one. No telling how much area the total complex takes up. One thing's certain, though. It's no ordinary computer of theirs, not for plain math work, nor even for specialized computations, like the one on Rigel 2. That was apparently used for astrogation, but it wasn't half the size of this. And navigation between stars, even with the kind of drive they must have had, is no simple problem." "The Herlogy think it's a god," she said. "That raised another problem," Rayanson mused. "The Outsiders built it, and must have left it here when they pulled back to wherever they were going, if they ever left the planet. But the Herlogy use it, and they communicate with it verbally. The Herlogy are apparently responsible for keeping it protected since then. But why should the Herlogy be able to use it?" "Unless they're outsiders after all," said Mara. Rayanson frowned. "No, I'm still not convinced of that. The clue seems to be that they communicate verbally with it. They must have been using it since before they developed telepathy. Couldn't there have been direct contact between the Herlogy and the Outsiders back when the Herlogy were just evolving out of the beast stage?" "There must have been," said Rayanson. "The temple rituals are conducted in an even older form of their language than most remembered, a proto-language that was kept alive only by the priest caste, because the machine had been set to respond to that language." "But aren't primitive languages usually composed of simple, basic words and concepts? How well could they communicate in such a language?" "Not very well," Rayanson said, "which would explain why the machine seemed to make mistakes, clumsiness of language. So the Outsiders, maybe, left the machine when they pulled out, but they set it to respond to the Herlogy language because our horse-faced friends were beginning to build a civilization of their own, and the Outsiders thought they'd leave them some guidance." He stopped for a moment, remembering that first linkage with Harung and Tebron's memories. "The Herlogy called them the Old Ones," he said. "And that order to Tebron about the other race that they would meet someday, that was based on outsider observations." "I wonder when the Outsiders were on Earth," Rayanson said. "Sometime after we'd started our own rise, certainly. Maybe in ancient Mesopotamia or India, or later during the Renaissance." "The time doesn't matter, does it?" Mara said. "They touched down on Earth, took note of us, and left. Somehow they thought we were going to develop more rapidly than we did." "Probably before the Dark Ages," Rayanson said. "Maybe they didn't see that 1,000-year setback coming." He stopped and stood up in the low passageway among the ancient circuitry. "So here we are, second-guessing the Outsiders. And outside, their protégés have disintegrators probably left by the Outsiders, and they're just waiting for us to try to get out." "Our newfound knowledge isn't doing us much good, is it?" she said. He shook his head slowly. "When I was still on the secondary sense-teach units, I met René Malholm for the first time. My father worked the spacers, so I don't even remember what planet this was on. But I remember the night I first saw René. He was speaking from the top of a blue lumber pile, shouting about the corporations that were moving in. He was getting all worked up about something, and several people in the crowd were shouting back at him. I stopped to watch. All of a sudden 6 or 7 men moved in from somewhere and dragged him down from where he was standing. There was a fight. People were thrown all around. I hid till it was over. When the crowd finally cleared, there was René. His clothes were torn, but he wasn't hurt. Every one of the men who attacked him had to be carried away. I think one of them was dead. René stood there laughing. Then he saw me hidden in the darkness, and he took me home. He told me that when he'd been younger, he'd worked his way all the way into Earth and studied some of the cultures there. He learned karate, which was an ancient Japanese way of fighting. Ranson took a deep breath. He said everything a person learns will be useful someday, and I believed him. A nice parable, Mara said. We could use him against the Hurlogy, though. Ranson was silent, thinking. If they could only catch the aliens off guard. But of course they couldn't now. He let his eyes wander aimlessly among the circuitry surrounding them. Tell me, old Core, what do we do now? After a moment, his eyes narrowed. He reached up and traced a connection with his fingers, back to the front toward the altar. It led directly to the speaker, the voice of Core. And if he could interrupt that connection, put his own voice through the speaker and out through the altar. Mara, we're going out. I found my own brand of karate for our friends out there. He helped her to her feet. She moved somewhat painfully, her broken left arm hanging stiffly at her side, but she made no protest. We've got to be fast. I don't know how well this will work. Depends how much they trust their clay-footed god today. Quickly he outlined his plan. Mara listened silently and nodded. Then he set to work. It was largely guesswork, following those intricate alien connections, but Ranson had seen this part of such machines before. He found the penultimate point at which the impulses from the brain were translated into sound and broadcast through the speaker. He disconnected this, his torn fingers working awkwardly on the delicate linkages. Ready? Mara was just inside the narrow passage behind the altar. She nodded quickly. Ranson twisted himself so that he could speak directly into the input of the speaker. He raised his voice to approximate the thin, high sounds of the Hurlogy language. Remain motionless. Remain motionless. Remain motionless. The command burst out upon the altar room of the temple, shattering the silence. The Hurlogy turned in surprise to the altar and stood still. Remain motionless. Remain motionless. It was the phrase he had heard the machine use so often to Tebron, king priest leader of all Hurlogy. It had meant something else then, but the proto-language of the Hurlogy had no precise meanings. Given by itself, it seemed to mean precisely what it said. All right, let's go out, Ranson said, and the two of them broke from behind the altar. The Hurlogy stood completely still. Several of those that Ranson had dropped with his stunner had recovered consciousness, but they made no move either. Ranson and the girl ran right through the quiet aliens. Only a few of them turned shadowed eyes to look at them as they passed. They made the outside colonnade in safety and paused there. They may see through this in a minute, Ranson said. Don't wait for me. Get out of the city. You are not coming? I won't be far behind. Get going. She hesitated only a moment, then hurried down the broad levels of the temple steps. Ranson watched her to the bottom, then turned and re-entered the altar room. Ranson went quickly among them, taking their weapons. Most of them made no effort to stop him, but a few tightened their grips on their disintegrators, and he had to pry those thick fingers from the weapons, cursing to himself. How long would they wait? There were 14 of the disintegrators. They were large and heavy. He couldn't hold all of them at once. He dumped 5 of them outside the altar room and returned to disarm the rest of the aliens. Sweat formed beads on his forehead, but he moved without hesitation. Another of the Hurlogy